Howard Jones here with this week's short sort of like tip, if you like, tips about, wanted to offer you some tips on texturing, texturizing, whatever the correct terminology is, and I just want to bring your attention to how important it is to vary the texture when you're dealing with distance and proximity. Excuse me a second when my cat decides to pay us a visit. So in this photo here, it's a coastal scene, and got all these strong sort of horizontal lines, the strata in this rock formation on the beach itself, and there will be a very big difference. There'll be a very big jump in terms of texture and shape making here compared to middle distance, then compared to what's actually in the solid mass back here in the cliff face. So this is what you've got to remember, that there's actually, in real terms there will be very little difference if you were to walk closer to these areas in the rock faces in these areas here. You'd see it exactly the same as you would see it here, of course. It's all about the proximity of you, the viewer. So the way we actually as painters need to deal with that, because we can't, the brain says that the textures up here are the same textures as here, and of course that is true, they are. The brain has the intelligence to work that out, but it doesn't work if we texture the background the same as we texture the foreground. I'm going to show you how I deal with this. So I'm just going to do something very basic here. I will bring, if this area here is my nearest area, okay, we see individual shapes like this. There's a lot of geometrical shapes here, and maybe this area is only let's say 50 yards away from us at its closest point. So we just first of all pencil in the movement. I always sort of refer to that as the movement, the general movement. It's very horizontal and it's broken up with textures. There's an area here which is that light grey area, and that's a nice area to play off the two different proximities. It's very mid-ground, this area, this pale grey area, and then of course we get into the I'm just going to rough this out. We get into the background, and you know, just to sort of reiterate, to get this point over, we've got to remember all the time that the texture here is very similar to the texture in the foreground, but we can't make it look like that. We've got to tell our viewer that this area here is further away from us than this area here. So let me just finish this off a second, and I'll if I don't complete this, it's purely so that I can just make this point. So I see, you know, clusters of shapes. I always think of them as facets, you know, a multitude of little facets, all breaking into their own little sort of angles. So, right, this is how I would tackle it. So it's not really about the colours, it's more about me wanting to show you how to deal with this particular issue of texture and distance. But if you want to know, I've just put 3 blues out. They happen to be out and I thought I could use them. 2 warm colours and a yellow. So I've got cerulean blue, cobalt blue, ultramarine blue, a colour called caput mortem, and a colour called burnt sienna, and this is just ordinary cadmium yellow. So let's start at the background. It's sort of the obvious place to start. So just put some sky in there. As I say, I don't want you to be distracted by the sky and the rest of the area. I want you to stay focused on the textured areas that I'll be creating. So up here is our greener areas. So even here, by using a mop brush with not too much water, so I take paint, not too much water. I actually aim to pick up dry paint deliberately, and that will give me this broken effect. So that's a texture for the background there. Now then, as I get into, because the areas down here, as we come further down closer to the ground level of the beach, we see a little bit more texture. So I'm going to start texturing to the degree of which I think we need to create, or yeah, to a degree that we need to achieve to keep this distance. Just glancing up at the photo, which is up here, and so if I had to describe what happens between foreground texture and distant, more textures that are further away, in a nutshell, it would be that closer textures are much tighter, they're much more complex. You'll find harder edges, darker, bigger playoffs between light and dark, whereas in the distance the texture becomes far more open, so it's not so tight, it's not so busy. So I'll just wait for this just to dry off a little bit, because I want to do some scraping, but in the meantime, here's something that I do for this particular distance, textures at this particular distance. I'll take say a round brush like this, pop it into my water tub, and then squeeze all the water out, as much of that water out as I can, and I'll look for areas that I think that the sun might be catching, and I'll just lift out some lights there. That's sort of texturing. It's strictly speaking, we refer to it as lifting out, but you could you could refer to that as texturing as well. But I'll show you the more obvious textures now in a moment. So I'd look for areas that I could, as I say, draw some light out of, like this. If you look at your reference photograph, which I'm doing, I often do this from imagination, and I have another video out there which I'll try to link to you about the benefits of working from imagination, but you need to have sort of watch that one separately. So there's a little bit of lift out where I see some lights hitting the surfaces, but now then, this is the sort of texture I would create. I'd be careful not to overdo it. I would look to certain areas and say, well, I can see some cliff rock faces and facets over here, all the time thinking about the strata in the rock. You know, these when the plates, the tectonic plates, were moving around millions of years ago. Of course, they moved in such a way where you can still see the strata, the lay of the rock face. So, because I haven't got too many darks in here, I mean in the photo there's quite a bit more darkness, and I can add more dark there if I so wish. But what I want to point you towards here is just how much more open the texturing will be over here compared to what we do in the foreground. It's like, another way to describe it is simply by saying these are sort of slightly more bigger shapes, but it's not just that. It's bigger shapes, more broad. You're applying a more broad effect than what will be down here. And it's tonal value, of course. The tonal value plays a huge part. Now I can just darken that area up a little bit, so what I'll do now is, once I've scraped what I think looks like those rock formations, I'll then take a little bit of dark paint. Perhaps I'll take my ultramarine blue and a bit of burnt sienna, and just in certain areas tap in. It's got to be worked wet in wet, this. I'll just tap in some areas of darker recesses. Just glancing there at my photo, taking some ideas like this. You know, I paint. I always have to say this, just in case somebody that's watching this is not aware that I paint in the loose style. I'm not looking for a photographic likeness here. This is how I approach these this subject matter in the loose style. I probably don't need to do much more in here than that for the moment. And then and now's an opportunity, if you so wish, to put just a little bit more texture in, and I'd be very, very careful not to overdo it here. So run through that area of paint and then run a line through here in places. All the time you've got to remember that whatever you do here cannot be trumped by this. Sorry, whatever you do here must not overshadow the foreground area, because if you use the sort of theatre analogy, this isn't the star character. The star character will be down here, so this is a secondary version, if you like, of what's going to go on in the foreground. So if I leave it like that, I think, you know, that's how that's my decision, that is sufficient texturing for this area at that distance. And as I said earlier, if this immediate foreground is just 50 yards away from us, then maybe this area back here is 300 yards away from us. These are approximations, of course. What's most important is that you do make the effort to create the different effects. So let's get into this foreground, and this time I'll be using a lot more paint, less water. So a bit of caput mortuum here and a little bit of burnt sienna. Just take two blues, the cobalt and the ultramarine, to darken that red up like this. But I will do a similar technique for this texture as I did back there, and that is to not put too much water with the paint. And I've got a very dark warm grey here, and I'll skim across some areas here. And just hint upon a little bit back there in one or two places. And now I'll put this brush in the water. Now this is a very wet brush, and I'll just apply areas that are much wetter here. So I've still got a mix here of of areas that I hit the surface with a drier mix, and then I come back in like I just did with the with a much wetter mix. So picking up a lot more water, but making sure that some of that initial brushwork that I did when there wasn't so much water in the brush is still there. So I look up at my reference, I mean, in time, as I say, you know, you don't always need photo reference. If you're painting a subject frequently enough, you know, you will know exactly how to create a rocky scene in your paintings. It's really, I think, when does it become important to paint from photograph? I think mostly when it's a commission. Somebody wants a painting, and of course, and you can understand why it has to be as it was. Maybe it's because, you know, it's an area that they know really well, and they want to see it portrayed that way. It's funny actually, because sometimes art and the requirements of commissions don't go hand in hand. So there is a much darker area, and I'll scrape. If I start scraping into these areas here with much bigger individual shapes like this, you'll see versions of this, but only in much more on a larger scale, because it's closer. And we can run through some areas with the point of this. So really just using this painter's knife here. You could use a credit card, but I find the painter's knife more robust. The credit card has a tendency to bend a little too much when you're needing to apply some serious pressure. So if I take to the point of the brush, of course I can get a pretty thin line through here. But think about the scale of these shapes compared to the scale of those shapes back there, and how much darker it is in the foreground compared to what it is back there. And then really all I'd need to do on top of that is just put in the odd individual rock up here. We're using a flat brush, a 1/2 inch flat brush here. Perhaps a couple of rocks together like this. So I'm hoping, you know, this sort of demonstrates in a way, if you get the shape making right and the correct scale and busyness of the texture that you're creating, it's surprisingly easy. The painting will just emerge in front of you. It's a case of just making sure that the scale of this here is very much different, very much bigger than the scale. I know it sounds like I'm stating the obvious, but it's surprising how many times I see the wrong texture in the distance. And the next time I do one of these, I'm going to show you how I tackle trees in the same way, that these shapes that we see a long way off are literally the same shapes as we have in front of us, right in front of us, but they need to look so different in your paintings. So I'll just run a little bit of we've got that lovely pale grey, silvery grey area here. Just put a very watery cerulean blue through there. And even though we know, again, our brains will say those are large, very pale grey pebbles, it would be wrong now to think of painting that area as individual little pebbles. Okay, you've got to make that play off between highly textured foreground and represent the same thing in the distance, but in a way by where it looks less busy, less intense, and then and then those two areas sandwich an area of stillness, of just a passive area for those pale grey pebbles.